Thanks very much for the invitation to come and speak today. First of all, I should say I'm not an academic, and second of all, I should probably say that I'm a social scientist rather than somebody involved in the arts or related studies. So my sort of presentation has a slightly different sort of focus and feel to it in a way. I work for an organisation called the Strategic Society Centre, and we are a non-partisan public policy think tank that looks, or if you like, sort of does analysis and research on big strategic public policy challenges facing society, and those have included, that's included work often related to sort of ageing and older people, including social care and pensions and housing. And we do have a website, and everything that we do is available for free. So if you are interested to find out more, do have a look at that web address. So today was an interesting challenge really for me. The idea of sort of portraying aging and the portrayal of aging, and thinking about its interaction in public policy. So what I thought I would do is sort of make some observations and thoughts on how the portrayal of aging does impact upon the public policy development process and what governments do. And also explore, if you like, some of the sort of limitations of the policy process in recognising the realities of particularly an increasingly diverse older population in the UK. I mean, first of all, I was sort of reflecting, well, you know, do portrayals of aging and older people actually matter for public policy? And I think the answer to that would have to be yes. And I identified basically three reasons. One is that clearly portrayals of aging determine public responses to political decisions. And I thought a particularly good example here was the budget of last year, budget 2013, which involved a small marginal change in income tax rates for people over 65. And critics of this political decision very quickly portrayed it as a granny tax. And very quickly there was a sort of big media storm that built up as a result of this repeated phrase of granny tax, granny tax, granny tax, even though it was actually only a really relatively small change. And there was a very interesting example, I thought, of the way in which critics were able to respond to the government and criticise what the government was doing through this rather emotive phrase of granny tax. Over the time that I've worked on ageing policy, I've also been interested in how the idea of an ageing population has become used to justify sort of policy reforms and changes sort of there, and there, if you like, but with sometimes a slightly tenuous link. So this government has actually introduced really historic reforms or changes to the National Health Service. And in a lot of the sort of presentation and discussion from the government around those changes, there's been quite a bit of the language of kind of, we need to reform the NHS because we have an ageing population. But when you dig down, there's sort of the link between why the particular changes that were being put in place for the NHS were directly justified by having an ageing population wasn't really clear. But nevertheless, this idea of we've got an ageing population, we need to reform the NHS, is very noticeable. And it's also worth observing. I mean, I deal a lot with civil servants, and I'm always struck by the fact that they're often very stressed and overworked and time limited, and like anybody else, they have a sort of set of assumptions and sort of fixed ideas, if you like, about aging and older people that naturally actually informs their work. It actually informs on a day-to-day basis what they do. So if you've got an afternoon, 4 hours to write a briefing note for a minister who's asked a question and wants some information on something, and you've got to very quickly draw together some evidence and draw together some analysis, you probably will draw upon the perceptions and assumptions that you as a sort of individual citizen have, even though you're perhaps working in a government department. And so, contemporary portrayals and assumptions around aging and older people, absolutely inform the work of civil servants and policy making. So overall, I think assumptions and portrayals and particularly narratives around aging and older people are important, clearly, in shaping public policy. Now, historically, pensioners in policy debates were very closely associated with poverty. And I think if you went back several decades, the phrase of sort of pension and poverty, the two words were sort of inextricably linked. But in a way, a sort of important policy success over the last particularly 15 years, has been a reduction in the proportion of the older population, the retired population, who actually sort of fall under the government's definition of living in poverty. This is a table from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, looking over time between 1961 and 2011 at the proportion of different sort of age groups who are officially defined as being in poverty. And if you can see in the sort of the middle box there, you can see that in 1961, over 1 in 3 pensioners in the UK officially lived in poverty, which is quite an astonishing thing, really. But by 2011, that had actually reduced to less than 15%, so fewer than 1 in 7, effectively, with a change particularly occurring between sort of 96, 97 and 2011. So actually a lot under the last Labour government. But this idea of sort of pensioner poverty and this sort of image of pensioners being vulnerable in poverty also informed a lot of sort of policy debate and, in a way, sort of created a perception of older people perhaps as sort of being vulnerable, which also informed, in a way, a kind of age discrimination in public policy as well. And I think a good example of this is the default retirement age. So up to 2011, it was possible to make somebody redundant in the UK just because they'd hit their 65th birthday. That you could actually just say, you're 65, so that's it, you're out of your job now, regardless of your capability to actually do the job. The very fact that you had reached the retirement age meant that your employer could sort of, send you packing and wouldn't have to ever explain why. They just had that right, which in retrospect feels like an astonishing piece of, age discrimination. And thank God it's gone. But it's, in a way, it was informed perhaps by the sort of perception of older people as being vulnerable and poor, and this idea of old, pensioners and older people being weak. I mean, it was always a dilemma, I think, with some of the older people's charities who do a lot of work to change ageing policy. We used to have a charity in the UK called Help the Aged, which had a very important social mission to help the aged, but equally reinforced by its name the very idea that aged people required help. And it's very interesting that the two charities that we used to have in the UK, Age Concern and Help the Aged, have now merged and called themselves simply Age UK, which is of course a much, much more neutral term and doesn't kind of reinforce this idea that somehow older people need help and in a way therefore kind of actually amplify the potential for age discrimination. But in a way, if that was the past, I think there are 3 key sort of emerging trends which are sort of changing the way in which ageing is portrayed in public policy and its influence on public policy. I mean, the first is sort of changing perceptions of the kind of healthy and active old. And so it was very easy to find this sort of slightly cliched picture now of your kind of, retiree in his Leica and on his racing bike. And this is increasingly a kind of popular image, isn't it, of the kind of reverting traditional sort of cliches of what it means to be retired and what people do in old age. And it obviously reflects wider changes in the society and the way that people are in retirement. But there is certainly a kind of, far more discussion in the world, say 15 years ago, of the kind of the idea of active old, but certainly the idea of it has taken hold. A second trend is growing awareness of the UK's ageing population. And there's a phrase, I think that's coming up far more in both the sort of general media and also in policy debate. And it's actually important to clarify what we mean by a sort of ageing population. I mean, it means people are living longer on average. It means that there are a higher total number of retirees in the population overall. And it also means that there are more retirees as a proportion of the population than there were previously. And I've put down here a few sort of stats of how many retirees there will be in future, but actually, I mean, having worked in this area for a while, I tend to let these numbers wash over me because each year there's a new set of numbers and a new projection. But I think everybody now is familiar with the idea that yes, for example, there are currently about 10 million pensioners or people over 65 in the UK. By 2024, there will be 15.5 million. So really quite a substantial increase. But these sorts of numbers are, they're produced by people like the Office for National Statistics every year now, and I think we've all got the message. But certainly the perception of having an aging population is clearly informing, and the rate, the portrayal of the UK population as aging is having an effect on on policy making and policy debate. The third key trend is an unprecedented level of wealth among older cohorts, driven in particular by high rates of owner occupation among what I'm sort of referring here to as the younger old, and of course the great UK property market and its endlessly rising property prices. I mean, two charts I've got here to sort of explore this a little bit more. This is some research that we did, or I was involved in quite a few years ago, and it shows the rate of home ownership among older age groups. But it actually, I've deliberately picked it out because it shows the figures for 2006, so this was nearly 10 years ago. And as you can obviously work out, the people who were in, if you like, the far left bar, by now most of them are in, if you like, the second bar along, because everybody is 10 years older. But the critical point here is, if you like, the difference between the 80 plus in 2006, where less than 70% owned their own home, but this sort of later cohort that is coming through, where actually 85% of people own their own home. And we are, in future, I guess, going to have a situation where 85% of all older people, all retirees, will own their own home. And that's a massive change from sort of previous decades. And then, of course, if you think that most people, if you think of the vast majority of people own their own home and ally that to property prices, then it will naturally result in higher levels of average wealth. Now, this chart is one that people find terribly difficult to read and slightly strange and scary to look at. But this is looking at, this shows the change between 1995 and 2005. And again, I've chosen a period really quite in the past now. It shows a change in average total housing wealth per person by different age groups. So along the bottom, you've got the sort of different age ranges. And on the left, you've got the total wealth. And so you can sort of see that somebody who was perhaps around 60, in 1995, which is represented by the yellow dot. Well, 10 years later, they were where the red dot is, that follow that line. And 5 years later, they were at the red dot, and 5 years later, they were at the black dot. And you can see that, for example, therefore, somebody who was 60 in 1995, by 2005, 10 years later, they were worth effectively twice what they were 10 years later. And this quite remarkable trend has clearly been driven by property prices and property wealth. And it's obviously also accelerated in some respects since 2005. But even as far back as the early 2000s, we were seeing a really substantial, unprecedented historic shift in average levels of wealth among the older population, primarily, almost entirely really, driven by the fact of home ownership and the fact of property prices. And this has led to sort of numerous, I think, influences on public policy, but it's also clearly changing the way that older people are portrayed in public policy debates. So, how do we now talk about sort of aging and older people in policy debate? Well, if we talked about in the past about sort of pension or poverty, the key things I would identify now are the idea of the power of the grey vote, that since all these older people, that they're clearly incredibly powerful at the ballot box, and political parties must be scared of them. And we seem to have kind of come full circle from talking a lot about pension or poverty, that naturally now increasingly we talk about wealthy pensioners, and this phrase, wealthy pensioners, keeps getting repeated in the media and in policy debates. And also this idea that the ageing population is sort of unaffordable to the state, that the government, that the Treasury can't afford an ageing population. And these are sort of some of the kind of the narratives and the ways in which I think ageing and older people are being presented now. But it's also, I think, actually interesting to dig down really, because these are all very compelling narratives. They're very kind of, they tell a good story, they tell an interesting story. But if you do dig down, the picture is often a little more complicated. So, as it says here, behind changing narratives, new assumptions can be as misleading as those previously used. So, we, at my think tank, we just did a little bit of sort of number crunching to explore the idea of the grey vote, this idea that the older population is so powerful in political terms. And what we did was to look at the prevalence of voting in general elections by different age groups. and then we took that percentage and multiplied it by the number of people who are actually in that age group, to come up with a kind of ranking by 10-year age group of how many votes you could expect from different age groups at the next election. So does that make sense? So if you like, you're talking about what is the rate of turnout, or what percentage of people turn out at the ballot box by age group, and then thinking, well, okay, if it's 60% and there's X million people in that age group, then 60% of X million is this number, and that will give you an idea of how many votes are going to come from different age groups. And what this shows by sort of ranking it in size is that actually the most powerful sort of 10-year age group, if you like, at the next election will be those aged 45 to 54. And then below that it'll be 35 to 44, so that's my category. And then a slightly older age group, the 55 to 64. But among the sort of, in terms of the retired population, you can see that, for example, the 75-year age group, there's actually, only, less than 3 million votes will be cast by the 75-year age group, which is actually, significantly less than half of the 45 to 54 age group. So this idea of a sort of enormous grey vote, which politicians should be scared of, looks slightly odd when you sort of put it next to the actual numbers of votes that are likely to be cast at the next general election by these different age groups. Another sort of question is this issue of wealth and this sort of the idea of the wealthy old. So if you dig down, you do generally find that actually, if you look at the sort of the very wealthiest households in society, they're not on the main pensioners. They're people from other age groups. And also within the older age group, there is actually significant inequality. So a few more charts to explore this, and I apologise now because some of these are really horrible charts. But here goes. This is the worst one. So I'll have a go at attempting this. Along the bottom of it, it shows wealth deciles. So the idea is that if you took the entire population and broke them up into kind of the 10% poorest, the 10% wealthiest, and then little 10% groups in between, then from left to right, you've kind of got the 10% poorest right on the left, and the 10% wealthiest right all the way on the right, and then the left hand, sort of the x-axis, or the left-hand bar shows the percentage of different age groups in these different categories, and then the lines going across the graph. Again, it's a very sort of messy sort of graph, but it indicates what percentage of different wealth deciles are drawn from different age groups. So the key thing here is just, if you like, to kind of go across all the way to the far right of the chart and see wealth decile 10. So this is, the 10% wealthiest household, the 10% of wealthiest households in UK society. And what you can see is that just over 35% are aged 55 to 64, so aren't retired, they're still in work, but they're obviously at the end of their working life, so you would have expected them to have managed to, to have accumulated the most wealth. But then if you look at, say, the group who are 75 to 84, they comprise just over 5% of this sort of wealthiest group in society. So actually, the kind of, the idea that the wealthiest groups in society are basically older people and pensioners, actually that's pretty misleading. That actually the wealthiest households in society are, well, they're drawn from a range of ages, but people 65 to 74 and 85 and over are actually a relatively small proportion of them. And this is another chart which is looking at the idea of income and comparing the distribution of income across the older population. And the point really here is one of inequality, the differences between, say, the bar that's on the left, which represents, if you like, the sort of, well, if you think that the sort of the poorest 25% of older people have an income of less than £200 a week. But then the 5% highest income, the 5% sort of those pensioners with the highest income have an income of over £600 a week. So you can see a sort of really quite substantial disparity between an inequality within the older population. And if we, instead of looking at income, look at wealth, you can again see this issue of sort of inequality. the poorest quarter of UK pensioners have household wealth of less than $100,000, you know, according to these figures, but the wealthiest 5% have over £800,000 in wealth. So there's a really substantial disparity there across the older population, and a very sort of diverse picture, which, if you like, isn't necessarily captured by the idea of the wealthy old in a way. And equally, the idea of an aging population as a drain on the state, and this idea that, you know, we have an aging population and we can't afford it, or we have an aging population and we have to do this, or we have to do this. Well, it is clear that having an aging population could mean higher costs for the state pension, for the National Health Service, and also for the local authority social care system, just by virtue of there being more individuals who may draw upon these services. But equally, there are a range of public policy options available to, you know, politicians, to governments, to respond to these changes. A simple one is things like raising the state pension age, which is already due to increase, to change the way in which public services are delivered, perhaps, and also new taxation, and new types of taxation, and choices around taxation and spending. So, you know, behind the idea of sort of aging population as unaffordable is actually a set of choices which the current government and future governments will be able to make as to whether or not that is actually true. So, in conclusion, I mean, what is clear is that the kind of new ways in which aging and older people are portrayed in public policy debates, and in sort of public debates may actually mask a more complex picture. And the older population is increasingly diverse and differentiated. And there is a challenge there for policymakers, but also, if you like, for the policy process as a whole, to really take account of the sort of the nuances and differences across the older population. And there is a question around whether or not these sort of new popular portrayals and sort of assumptions around the older population will end up, if you like, distorting policy development. The idea that, you know, we will sort of, you know, change policy and improve policy and it will improve. Well, actually, will we end up with potentially worse policies or bad policies because some of the ways in which ageing is being portrayed don't truly sort of capture the real picture. And so I think with that I will stop, and hopefully that will lead to discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you, James. Okay, over to you, the audience. Questions? Okay, we got one, the lady down there, Sophie, if you could, and then Senior, yes.
Yeah, mine is a comment. I work in adult social care, and my comment is about, you speak of choices, and yes, choices are being made, and one of them that I notice is how people are, personal care is advertised, personalisation, and providing your own carer, appointing your own carer, but there's a growth in brokerage, and one of the choices seems to be to increase brokerage so that you get organisations like Age UK, which many people regard as a charity, but the brokerage they provide for people to appoint their own carers and manage an employee effectively, the insurance, etc., costs money. So there's more and more steps between the client and the carer, and you get personal care or personal choices at a cost.
No, certainly social care policy has been, characterised by the sort of choice and control agenda. And that has been interesting how, in a way it's quite a sort of, if you like, a consumerist sort of agenda. I think a lot of people say, well, it's reflective of a consumer society. People don't want the services they're given. They want to kind of have choice and control. And there are very compelling arguments for that, but equally it's been interesting how I think particularly recently there's been a bit of research to kind of that sort of suggests, well, actually there are costs to that as well, and that it isn't suitable for everyone. Not everybody wants to be in to be kind of managing their own budget and employing people themselves. And it's an interesting sort of, there's a bit of an interesting clash there between sort of a lot of political appetite and interest in this idea of giving people sort of choice and control, but it being slightly divorced from people's actual sort of wishes and what necessarily works for them. And yeah.
And the gentleman over there, sorry.
I'm interested in the employment and the pensions, and I thought the graphs you showed were really helpful. But getting the new policies through ministers, are they convinced by these graphs? Because from what you were starting off to say, it sounds as if the stereotypes were from public media. We've heard some of that already today. Maybe it's a minister's mum who tells him, and you know, all the graphs in the world aren't going to convince him to change things. I wonder how you're going to get public policy changed.
Well, I've been thinking about that for years. How do you change public policy? Well, I think, I mean, what I observe is that, you know, in studies of policy making, there's the idea of evidence-based policy, and in theory, policy making and political decisions should all be born of evidence, and we should all be using evidence. And certainly, we as a think tank, I would like to say, think we are, you know, we produce evidence, we do quantitative research, and so in that sense, we are contributing to the evidence base. But it's still very much the case that politicians ultimately, if they don't like the evidence or the evidence doesn't say what they want, will ignore it. And equally, there is also the power of just ideas and narratives which take hold, and the way which in which particular things get framed, and where if they're sufficiently compelling, counter arguments or counter analysis just never gets a look in. So a good example on ageing policy is the winter fuel payment. Now, in the last sort of couple of years, we've had this sort of big thing of, you know, why do we hand out winter fuel payments? This is ridiculous. What a nonsensical, you know, thing. What a nonsense policy. And there's a, growing movement to kind of either scrap them or just means test them to the very poorest pensioners. And yet, there's also in the UK a massive problem with what's called preventable winter deaths. So essentially older people dying during the cold of winter, and the death rate increasing. And this is a very complex policy problem, and it has multiple causes. But one of them is pretty obviously the fact that people are afraid to put the heating on because they're afraid of the cost. And the IFS has done research to show that when people receive the winter fuel payment, they spend more on fuel. So it just has a very nice subtle effect that if you get an extra bit of money labelled for some particular use, actually it will influence how you spend that money, and you will spend commensurately more on fuel. And certainly, the sort of anecdotal evidence is also pretty clear that if you talk to people, it gives, for a lot of people, this gives an enormous amount of reassurance. Winter's coming, I'm afraid of putting the heating on, I'm going to try and sort of find ways to stay warm. There's some extra money here, I'm going to feel slightly more comfortable about putting the heating on. And so arguably in the context of preventable winter deaths, and also the costs of cold related to the illness to the NHS, among older people, which stretches into billions of pounds. The winter fuel payment is a phenomenally good policy. It's a phenomenally intelligent policy, and really quite a cunning one. And yet, particularly in the last year or two within sort of Westminster, this idea has taken hold of, why do we give winter fuel payments out? This is completely ridiculous. And any but time that somebody wants to come up with a new spending proposal, where can we get the money from? I know, we'll get rid of winter fuel payments, we'll spend them over here, which is it completely ignores the evidence analysis about excess winter deaths, but also could actually be more expensive, because if people spend less on fuel, you'll have more cold-related illness in winter, and also, quite frankly, you could well have more people dying from the cold. So completely bizarre that you would have really quite an effective policy being kind of torn apart at every juncture. But there it is, and that's because people get, they get an idea in their head, they run with it, and it shapes sort of debate and politicians. And it's one so sorts of, they're almost like kind of, I call them there's this phrase, I've never quite known how to pronounce it, memes or mimes. Memes, is that right? Yes, it's like the idea that in this modern kind of internet-connected world, certain kind of ideas will suddenly kind of multiply and take off, and they kind of, this idea of ideas bouncing around society. And, the winter fuel payment meme has been very powerful. In Westminster, that it's sort of, yes, it's really symbolised, this, why do we give, why this sort of silly little sort of sop to older people giving them this winter fuel payment, completely divorced from the actual analysis and evidence of how people spend the money and the underlying policy problems associated with it, which is a long way of answering your question to say no, policy making is not always improved, but we do what we can,
Thank you.